Minister, great to have you on our program, The Business Detective. To begin, tell us what do you do now since your retirement from politics?
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I am now a professor at the European University Institute in Florence, Italy, where I teach political economy, and also I teach about crisis. And I also I'm Dean of Executive Education. We do professional development courses for people from around the world.
Okay. You got a lot of prominence being the Greek finance minister during the crisis. What are some of the key challenges that you faced during that time?
Very hard to summarize them in just a few. We were a country that faced a triple deficit. It was a real deficit in our in our government data. So we were spending much more than we were receiving, and our debt had arrived to about 130% of GDP. We were facing an external deficit in our current account. And perhaps most importantly, we were also facing a confidence deficit with our European partners, because they no longer believed the willingness of the government to undertake reform, as well as our underlying economic data. So we found ourselves in a situation at the end of 2009, after a new government took office, that was determined to make a difference, to take some very tough decisions, and that was through a bailout agreement that was agreed in mid-2010 with the European Commission and the IMF.
What are some of the learnings from that Sri Lanka can look at?
Look, I am always very careful when I try to draw lessons from Greece for other countries that are going through a similar experience, because every country has its own characteristics, has its own history. For example, it's very hard to compare the kind of monetary policy that that Sri Lanka can or should do with Greece, where in the case of Greece, we are part of the Euro system. We do not set our own interest rates. They're set by the European Central Bank, where we are bound by a broader fiscal framework within European treaties. So it's not very easy to draw direct lessons. However, I do think that in all these crises, there are common characteristics. And I think if you look back, some of the common characteristics are typically these crises have precursors. One should know that they're coming, and we all tend to ignore the warning lights. So when the crisis hits, we are surprised, but we shouldn't have been surprised. But that's in the past. In the sense, perhaps most interesting to people watching or listening is the kind of lessons as you move forward, because you are in a very delicate moment now, where you've had an agreement, standby agreement with the IMF, but not yet an agreed sort of a seal of approval from the IMF board. You are in a bit of a unique situation because of the debt distribution and the debt held by China, especially, in India and other countries. So you are already taking some very difficult measures with, of course, a lot of social protest and unrest. So if I could sort of draw some lessons from the Greek case, which I think we learned over the hard way, because we went through a very, very tough recession. We lost about 27% of GDP within the space of a few years. So one sort of lesson, which is also towards the creditors, is that a country should take the measures necessary, but it should have the time to be able to do it in an orderly fashion. Excessive retrenchment, excessive austerity up front hurts more than it helps. Now, this is a lesson that I'm saying it's both for the domestic, for government, but it's also for creditors. If they impose measures which are too harsh, this becomes a boomerang for the program, because programs need to keep social acceptance to be able to go forward. So there's purely economic lessons. A second one is is that structural reforms, which, for example, reform public enterprises, which create institutional countermeasures to government authority, which give more power to independent agencies. These are very, very important, and often more important than short-term measures of increasing taxes or fuel or whatever. So these structural, deeper measures are very, very important. They include privatization, but not privatization in the sense of a fire sale, but more of restructuring public enterprises, seeing what needs to be privatized, and for the rest, accepting corporate governance rules and measures as in the rest of the world. And then there are some more political lessons. We went through a number of elections, complete upheaval of the political system. You should expect something like that to happen. It is kind of an unavoidable part of the process. Typically, governments that start the difficult road are not the ones that finish the difficult road, because eventually there is a lot of public unrest, there are elections, governments change. And I think it's important for whoever is in power to try to generate a minimum of political consensus around the necessity of some of the reforms. Playing too much politics is very much counterproductive for the country and makes the adjustment process much, much longer than it should be.
Okay. How does a government sell a IMF program to the public, especially when it requires a huge increase in taxes and etc., etc.?
Tough one. We all know the IMF does not have the best reputation, and in Asia, I mean, there's a lot of difficult memories from the involvement of the IMF. The IMF is now, I would say, different from how it used to be. It is more balanced in its views. It is trying to be more, let's say, mindful of the impact on the most vulnerable in society. So a lot depends on the negotiation. I have not seen in detail the standby agreement, so I'm not sure to what extent it does incorporate certain cushioning policies. But I think it's important for the government, for any government, to do two things. One, to insist on the necessity of the underlying structural elements of the IMF program, and in a sense, own them, take ownership of them, not just say it's the IMF, we can't do anything about it there, because these are important for the country, whatever happens, right? It's IMF or no IMF, they're important. And the second is to try to the extent possible, to counterbalance some of the harsher measures with some kind of support for the most vulnerable. That because in crises like this, the ones that are hit the most are, of course, the most vulnerable parts of the population. So constantly see if there's any fiscal space to be able to help the most vulnerable. For example, if you have increases in prices, to be able to, or in fuel and energy, to reduce some of the prices that hit the most vulnerable households. So these kind of countermeasures. But I know that the narrative with the IMF is always very, very difficult. We shouldn't demonize the IMF, but it's not above criticism either.
Okay. Any specific advice how we should be dealing with the private creditors?
You are in a particular position. We did not have a nation which is outside the normal debt restructuring framework as being one of our main creditors. The Greek debt was held by other European countries, US funds, US and European banks, etc., and they're all within the framework that is agreed upon. And my understanding is that you're currently in a very delicate position where the IMF is not moving forward before China gives assurances of debt restructuring, whereas China claims it has given such assurances, and the government and the country is trying to find a middle way, basically. I understand that China has given sort of 2 years of a moratorium in repayments. That's clearly not enough. There has to be a more specific commitment on debt restructuring. So I would leverage to the extent possible the international institutions in a discussion with China. It goes broader than Sri Lanka, of course, because it's a question of Chinese investments and the debt that it is incurred throughout the world. Africa is a very good example. And China's unwillingness to accept a framework that goes way beyond Sri Lanka. So there may be, ideally, one would want a clean solution, a real framework, which includes perhaps some collective action clauses, some kind of elements that are typically used. That's the ideal solution. There could be a plan B where there is a partial agreement conditional on, and you move forward, and then there's more sort of trust gained from both sides. I would, to be more specific than that, I would have to be privy to the negotiations going on, which I'm not.
Okay. How should the private sector be responding to this crisis without moaning about high interest rates, etc., etc.?
The private sector within, I think we generalize always the private sector. When crises like this hit, you've got some really good companies that are caught out and are in danger of collapsing with no fault of their own, and some not so good companies that were in trouble anyway, and this crisis precipitates it. So this it's also an occasion where you distinguish between the two, and the difficult task for governments is to figure out how to help the ones that are indeed capable of surviving, and sort of not help the ones that are destined to fall, and where you cannot bail out every single private company that was in trouble before anyway. But it is important to me, it is important for the private sector, especially for the export-oriented part of it, the one that has connections abroad, to reach out to its international creditors and to show. One of the difficulties that many Greek firms had, and I'm sure the same thing is happening in Sri Lanka, is that the sovereign, let's say, the conditions for sovereign debt carried over to the conditions of lending of private companies. In some cases, private companies are in a better position than the sovereign, because they have established markets, they can sell. So to the extent possible, leverage international networks and relationships to separate the conditions. That applies to large companies, of course, that do have this international footprint and can do it, and use their traditional banks, the ones that give them letters of credit, to continue to be able to have a normal operating process than not, and insist on a seat at the table with the government and the creditors, because often interests of the private sector are left aside in these kind of agreements, which are more on retrenching in the public sector, and sometimes the private sector pays the bill for that. So I think it's important to insist on having a seat on the table and a voice.
A quick comment on the role of central bank in banking stability.
Sri Lanka is in a unique position vis-a-vis how we were, because we were part of the Euro system under the control of the European Central Bank. But I think, and my understanding is that part of problems in the past have been the lack of a perception of independence from the central bank. So to the extent that legislation and practice, in terms of, for example, appointing people that are well known for their independence and integrity at arm's length from the government, these are extremely important signals to the international financial community. They are signals that there will be a monetary policy which is not dictated, which is independent, and which can safeguard stability at the time of extreme turbulence. Nothing is worse than situations such as the one that Turkey is going through, for example, at the moment, where the president is sort of dictating interest rate cuts in the middle of double-digit and sort of sky-high inflation. That does not help. It doesn't even give a short-term respite, and certainly it sends the exact wrong signals to the international community.
Okay. My last two questions to you, Minister, is given the volatility in markets, will there be a nasty correction in Forex markets in the next couple of months?
Oh, I would not hazard a guess there. We are in a very particular situation. The combination of the lingering aftermath of COVID with the uncertainty about the pickup of China, it's picking up, but it's not there yet. And of course, the war in Ukraine create an environment with very high risks. And we are seeing the West weaponizing the financial system through the sanctions to Russia, understandably, and I fully support that because that's the only way to go. But this has implications for fragmentation of the global financial system. So how this will impact on the Forex market and the correction, that's for people who follow it on a more day-to-day basis than me to be able to say.
My final question to you, Minister, is what is your outlook for the global economy in the next 5 years? And will there be big shifts?
I think that we need to distinguish between the very short run with the medium run. I think in the next year or two max, we will continue to have turbulence. Again, a lot will depend on the geopolitics. A lot will depend on the resolution of the war in Ukraine. But I think that the beyond the 2 years, we're seeing productivity pick up in a number of countries. We're seeing impact of a new wave of innovations in IT. Behind that, we're seeing supply chains reconstituting themselves after COVID. So I think that the signs are not great for the next 12 months. I think that beyond that, we could be looking at a rather robust recovery of the global economic system.
Thank you very much. It was great talking to you.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you.